Introduce myself. My name is Arthur Reed Niebler, and I want to share with you my many years of service at the Jockey Underwear Company here in Kenosha. But I will try to keep my comments brief, if you get my meaning. I was born on November 17th, 1882, in Danville, Pennsylvania. My parents were Henry and Rebecca Niebler. My father worked in the iron mine. In fact, you might consider him one of the original Pennsylvania Steelers. Thanks to good fortune and my hard work in school, I was the first in my family to attend college. Starting in 1899, I went to the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. 4 years later, in 1903, I graduated and also married my high school sweetheart, Mary Keefe. That same year, I was also offered a job in another city in Michigan, Benton Harbor, and Mary and I decided to relocate there. It was a factory that made documents and paper, where I was asked to be the sales manager and then later was promoted to general manager. Mary and I were determined to start a family as soon as possible, but unfortunately, that was not to be. Mary suffered 2 miscarriages and a stillborn child. So we were afraid after the initial 5 years that we were not destined to be parents. Things were going well for us until 1916, when the war clouds loomed over Europe and the United States. It was the war to end all wars, or so they thought. You may know it better as World War I. I was required to register for the draft, which I did, but I was very concerned that Mary would be left alone. Fortunately, I wasn't drafted, and then in 1918, 2 wonderful events occurred. The armistice was declared and the war ended, and Mary gave birth to our first child. After 15 years of marriage, we had a son, and we named him Arthur Jr. It was a miracle in our opinions. 4 years later, in 1922, another 2 important events in my life occurred. One, a friend of mine and myself started our own ad agency business back in Michigan. So Mary and I moved back there. And when we were in Michigan, Mary gave birth to our second child, a daughter, Mary, of course named after her. Isn't it interesting that for sons there is the designation junior, but for daughters it's just Mary. But we referred to her as Little Mary. Everything was going very well. Our business was doing wonderfully. And then in 1922, I received a phone call, sort of out of the blue, and it was from the Cooper Underwear Factory here in Kenosha, Wisconsin. They were offering me a job as sales and marketing manager at their company. Well, this was an offer too good to refuse. So the 4 of us packed our bags and moved to Kenosha. In 1928, Kenosha was a thriving, growing community of about 50,000 people. We settled in and became very, very entrenched in what was going on in this community. The children did very well in school. My wife, Mary, became very involved in civic activities and also was very active at the Episcopal Church, St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. And I too was very active in community affairs, including the Kenosha Country Club, where I became president, also the Elks Club, the Chicago Athletic Club, and Kenosha's Youth Association. Let me tell you a little bit more about working for Cooper's. At the time I came to Kenosha, undergarments, or as they were sometimes referred to as unmentionables, were about the same as they had been over 100 years ago for men. They were a one-piece union suit with very little ventilation and not that comfortable material. One of the first things we did when I came to Cooper's was to develop a new type of union suit, which we called the singleton, which was sleeveless and short-legged, and that became fairly popular. Then the other major area which we were concerned with was marketing. As I said, they were not considered an item that could be put on display in most department stores or wherever they were sold, but we wanted to change that. So we decided to put them in, normally they were kept under the counter and they were wrapped in brown paper. That's how forbidden they were to be seen in public areas. But we thought the time had come to change that, and we wrapped these singletons in cellophane wrappers. That way they could be put on counters or display racks wherever they were sold, and this did make a big difference in our sales. Everything was going fairly well for me until October of 1929, when the stock market crashed, and of course the beginning of the Great Depression. This was a hard time for everybody in the United States, especially businesses like ours, because there was not a huge demand for the kind of product we were producing, especially when people were fighting to find shelter and food for their families. This was not a priority, undergarments. But we thought if we worked toward a better product, perhaps we could market it better. So I was in charge of that. I was at that time designated an apparel engineer. And in 1934, I received a postcard from a friend who was vacationing on the French Riviera. On the verso of the card, there was a picture of a man in a bathing suit, but it was unlike anything you would see in the United States. It was very, very small. In fact, I believe I have, this is more or less what it looked like. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that term. So I looked at the picture and I thought, I think I could make this into a new form of underwear. So I started sketching, looking at various materials, trying to find something comfortable, flexible, that men would probably want to wear more than the singleton. And in 1934, at the end of the year, I put in an application for a patent with the United States Patent Office, and I did get it. And in January 1935, we introduced the jockey short at Marshall Fields in Chicago. And on the first day, we sold out. We sold all 600 of our underwear that we had there that day. The next week, we sold 12,000 pairs. So it was a success. And let me show you another picture here. This is what the jockey short looked like when we first created it. But I continued to work on this design, and I did create something which was called the Y-shaped brief, which had overlapping panels and was much more comfortable than the original design. By the way, if you're not familiar with the origin of the name jockey, it has nothing to do with jockeys on the racetrack. It is because the jockey short or brief, the brief, was a design that gave more support to men, just like the jockey short or the jock strap that was invented in the 1890s. So we took the word jock strap and turned it into jockey. And also in 1936, the company's name changed from Cooper's to Jockey. We were in demand all over the world. We had applications for licenses to produce our product in almost every corner of the world, beginning with Canada in 1936, and that was followed soon by Australia, Asia, Africa, and South America. I was one of the people in charge of going to these countries and working with the people there to make sure our designs were followed through correctly and produced in quality form. Life was good for me until 1951 when my lovely wife Mary became ill after struggling with chronic problems for many years, and she passed away. At that time, my 2 children and my 4 grandchildren, Arthur had 4 children, we were very, very saddened to see my wife at the age of 66 pass. I continued working at Jockey until the late 50s. Around 1957 is when I was still going into work every day and still very active when I took, unfortunately, a bad fall at my home. I was confined to bed and I never recovered from that injury. So I'm buried here next to Mary, my wife, and also Mary, little Mary, my daughter, who passed away in 2011. She lived a long life. I'm heartened to know that Jockey is still here in Kenosha, still thriving, doing even better than when I was alive, with products for both men and women. I'm very proud that I was the man who invented the Jockey brief. Thank you all for coming.
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Martin Winther. That's Winther, actually from the old country of Denmark where I was born. It's pronounced Winther. I was born on November 4th, 1888 to Jens and Maddie Winther in Denmark. And when I was 4 years old, our family emigrated to the United States. At that point, it included my younger brother, Anthony, who was 2 years old, and my parents, and we took the boat to New York City, at which point we boarded a train and came to Manitowoc, Wisconsin, where my mother's cousin was living. Now, my father was an artisan, and he would go around to many of the churches and apply gold leaf and painting. He also painted portraits of many of the locals, which the subject of those paintings really enjoyed. He also made violins like his father before him. And pretty soon, I had 4 more brothers and sisters. See, there's Jenny, there was Arnold, Frederick, and Frida. And with a larger household, we found it necessary to move to a larger house, and we moved to Neenah, Wisconsin. That's where I received my education. And in 4 years, I was able to go all the way through 8th grade. Now, alas, after 6 years of bliss in Neenah, our lives were once again thrown into turmoil when my father suddenly passed away of pneumonia when I was 13. At that point, Mother had another cousin, Jens Bush, who lived here in Kenosha and invited us to move down this way. And after some searching, Mother was able to find a house to rent that was located at this point, in this time, southwest part of Kenosha, which was much smaller than today, a little area the locals like to call Snakeville. The house no longer there because the St. Joseph's Academy over in 69th occupies the space where that rental property was. After a while, she was able to save a little money and was able to purchase a house there, with enough room for Anthony and myself to conduct electrical experiments, as we were tend to do in those days. Now, I was able to procure employment with Chicago Brass, which is now American Brass, and Anthony also followed me there. After that, I was able to get an apprenticeship with Jeffrey Motor Company, which is actually a company that had started out in Chicago making bicycles when Thomas Jeffrey moved up here to Kenosha and started making powered motorcycle cars and then motor cars. Anthony soon followed me there as well. Things were going well until at age 17, my life was upended when I was diagnosed with a case of tuberculosis. My family sent me out to Los Angeles, which back in the 20s and early teens was a small town of only 200,000 people. 200,000 people. And the air was clean and healthy back in those days. Now, Mr. Thomas Jeffrey, the owner of Jeffrey Motors, whose mausoleum's on the hill over there, assured me that I'd have a job when I returned, which I did 2 years later. When I was 21, my mother remarried to a gentleman named Peter Lundskow, who was a Danish widower with 7 children of his own. So I was able to buy my mother's house, and after some renovation and redecoration, I married Marcella Link on July 25th, 1911, and we were to have 1 son and 3 daughters. The angel of death again struck our family, and it took my 2 youngest brothers within 4 years of each other. It was Arnold and Frederick. They both died of tuberculosis. Back at Jeffrey, a couple of men had quit the model making department, which in today's terminology would be more research and development, and Frederick Purdy had asked me if I could help out in their department, which I agreed. Well, a couple years later, Frank Purdy up and left, and I was left in charge of the entire department, making me the youngest department head at Jeffrey Motors at the age of 25. Meanwhile, Tony had received a patent for a radio electrical circuit that he had created, and with a little startup money of $28.60, started making radios. Received another patent on a 7-tube radio device that's called the Oriole. Sales were great, and he was able to purchase a larger facility, larger manufacturing space, and offices. Charles Jeffrey, the son of founder Thomas Jeffrey, approached me one day and asked me about the feasibility of making 4-wheel drive vehicles, because he had a friend who was a captain in the Army Quartermaster Corps, and the Army was interested in finding a 4-wheel drive truck. Now, there was a firm in Clintonville that was already making a 4-wheel drive vehicle, but we thought we could make one more efficiently. Now, at this time, this is before the United States had formally joined in World War I, and German submarines were known to be patrolling the waters around Great Britain. And Jeffrey Motors Company had personnel that needed to go to and from England and Europe to check on wartime contracts. So Charles and I were both booked to travel on the RMS Lusitania. However, my passport was delayed, and Charles went ahead without me. 3 days later, I was to leave on the SS Transylvania, and it was aboard that ship at sea that I learned of the sinking of the Lusitania by the German U-boat. The Lusitania had gone down in 18 minutes, and there were only 792 survivors and 1,168 passed away. And I was relieved to find out upon arrival at London that Charles had survived the sinking. I was also more relieved that I was not on board the ship at the time. However, the sinking of the Lusitania did leave Charles a changed man, and he started to reevaluate his priorities at Jeffrey Motors, at which point I struck out on my own and created Winther Motors. Started out as Winther Motor Truck Company and then Winther Motors. However, timing was not very good, because in November of 1918, World War I ended. And of course, all government contracts for trucks were immediately canceled. Add to that surplus trucks were dumped on the market. We couldn't conduct any business. And the radio business for Anthony wasn't much better, with all the wartime production now idled. He had more competition from larger manufacturers. So we decided to spend more time on research and development. We dove into several projects, including transmissions, magnetic couplings, and such. We even considered making an automatic transmission for cars. But we found the device would probably be too heavy, and instead adapted it to use it with motors that run more constant, like air conditioners, and came up with a coupling that we were able to sell to the Pullman train car company for use in their train cars. And that was the beginning of the Dynamatic Corporation. I myself coined the term Dyna being electric, matic being something that was automatic. Now, during World War I had spent quite a bit of time in Washington procuring those government contracts for Jeffrey Motors, and it was at that time I became acquainted with a certain Admiral Richard Byrd. Well, one day I got a call from him in 1938 saying Mr. Byrd informed me that he'd purchased a ship with the intent on going on a South Polar expedition, but he had a problem. The vessel needed to be its own icebreaker. He needed for the ship to be able to ride up on an ice floe and then the weight of the vessel to break the ice. And he needed a special coupling for the motor transmission. I assured him that Dynamatic Corporation could create such a device, and we produced it, and Dynamatic delivered on time and gave it as a gift to the expedition in 1940. Upon his successful return, he sang the praises of the Dynamatic Corporation and insisted that he could not have made the expedition without the use of our coupling. Well, later on in 1948, well actually, we've got World War II here coming up. Second World War brought many new innovations, including radar, and the Army Signal Corps had chosen one of our Dynamatic turret motors to use on their new radar arrays. Now the radars these days are dishes, but back then they were a flat antenna, and they used our Dynamatic motor to point it accurately, not constantly spin it. Now 6 of these units just happened to be installed on a little island in the Hawaiian chain called Oahu. And on the morning of December 7th, 1941 at 7:02 a.m., a radio operator operating one of those stations saw a blip on the screen and reported it to his superiors. They discounted it as being a glitch with the system because the radar equipment was so new, and, well, as they say, the rest is history. Dynamatic went on to become a very successful corporation, and we merged in 1948 with the Eaton Company. We relocated to Cleveland, Ohio. I stayed on the board of directors, and Anthony followed along as a consultant. It's about this time in our life that we decided Marcy and I wanted a summer home and winter home. Our summer home we built up in Eagle River, Wisconsin, and Anthony followed shortly, built a house next to ours. Marcy and I also discussed retiring to Florida, as all 3 of our girls had graduated from Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. We liked the area and chose Claremont, which is very close to today's Orlando. We built our winter home there, and wouldn't you know, Anthony followed suit, built his home about a quarter mile from us there. Now it was down in Florida one evening when Marcella and I were entertaining company, and she had excused herself to go to the bedroom, and it was after a prolonged amount of time I became concerned and went to check on her and found her lying across the bed, and she had suffered a massive stroke and passed away that evening at 80 years old. Now, I really didn't enjoy living alone, so in 1967 I was to marry Dorothy Wells up in Eagle River, Wisconsin. I myself passed away at 93 in 1982 down in Claremont, Florida. While I had had some successes and some failures in my business throughout my life, I believe that real lasting wealth only comes from the fruits of sweat and toil, either manual or mental. And while my brother and I were prolific inventors, the word entrepreneur better represents us, for between the 2 of us we had 288 patents. And in these modern times it seems that you almost need a doctorate before you can even begin to start to develop and invent something new. But I say to the young people today, see a need, feel a need, go invent something and make the world a better place. Thank you very much.
I'm Trixie's husband, ex-husband. I'm Dick Wells. And you may have heard, I am also the father of a man you may have heard of. George Orson Welles, the great actor of theater, radio, and movies. Yes, I've more or less been the afterthought behind the fame and recognition of my wife and second son. They said that you would be by today, so I obtained some copies of my inventions, if you'd like to pass those around. And I've jotted a few things down about my career. I was born November 13th, 1872, in St. Joseph, Missouri, the only child of Richard and Mary Wells. Now, there's a sordid tale. My parents' tumultuous relationship. My mother, Mary Blanche Head, was a daughter of Kenosha's prominent attorney, Orson Sherman Head. When she ran off to Missouri at the tender age of 15 and married my father, Richard Jones Wells, 11 years her senior in age, my grandfather, Orson Sherman, blew a gasket. Not long after I was born, we moved back to Kenosha, and I lived at my grandfather and step-grandmother Head's house. Now, I don't remember him, since he died when I was 2.5. My father left us when I was about 9. He moved to Chicago and my parents divorced. About this time, my mother met Frederick Gottfredson, a Danish man who ran a brewery with his father. She and Frederick built a house on Library Square, not far from Grandfather Head's house. They had a son when I was about 15. I had been a moderately good student at public school. I did enjoy mathematics, and I found I had a flair for inventing. When I was 25, my mother decided I should go to work for her sister, Harriet, and husband, George Ewell, who ran Bain Wagon Works after the death of Edward Bain. As my career took off, I decided it was time to move out on my own, but not too far from my mother. When I was 29, I bought a house just around the corner from her and my stepfather. As I continued to do well in business, I was held in high esteem here in Kenosha. I changed the spelling of my last name from Wells, adding a second E, W-E-L-L-E-S. 1903 was a momentous year for me. My uncle and I started a new business. I received my first patent, and I got married. Uncle George and I started Badger Brass, where we produced bicycle lamps and later automobile lamps. At Badger, I was responsible for the disbursement of all monies for investments and employees. But I also enjoyed tinkering with various inventions. My first patent was for a acetylene gas heater. The first usage was at my mother and Frederick's home. I also created several lamps, reflector plates, burners, and sockets for automobiles and bicycles. I developed many new inventions in which I was awarded a patent for 26 patents in 13 years. In my free time, I enjoyed the Chicago nightlife. I would go down to the theater to see what sweet, young, inspiring actress or singer I could meet afterwards and wine and dine her. Perhaps I had too much time and money on my hands, but I was young and available and needed diversion, I suppose. Well, on one of these visits to Chicago, I met an attractive, intelligent, and talented young 22-year-old concert pianist named Beatrice Ives. Her stage name was Trixie. Our tastes ran somewhat different. I think that's why what drew us together at first. I liked jazz music and she preferred classical piano. She could be stern and puritanical, but there was still fire in those dark eyes of hers. My mother thought Trixie was a bad match, not worthy of her intelligent, worldly son. Despite her objections, we were married. We wed in Chicago on November 21st, 1903. In the presence of my mother, my half-brother, and Beatrice's parents. Our marriage was the talk of the small town of Kenosha. We were only married about a year when our first son, Richard Ives Wells, was born. But as he grew, it became evident he did not have the sharp mind and brilliant intellect of the Wells and Head families. My mother actually despised her first grandchild. She saw little Dickie as weak and unworthy of the Wells name. I continued to tinker with new inventions. This was the age of transportation. Automobiles were the new craze, but the bicycle also remained very popular. These industries kept me busy supervising productions at Badger Brass and working on my inventions for both means of transportation. Then, in 1911, I introduced the autobus car to Kenosha with seating for 20 passengers. What was new about my autobus was the method of payment. Instead of a conductor going around and collecting the fares, the bus was equipped with a money deposit machine beside the driver. I understand all buses have this now. The bus route ran from the train depot east and south past Kemper Hall to 68th Street, running from 6 a.m. till midnight, 2 to 3 times an hour. In 1914, Beatrice became the first woman in Wisconsin to hold an elected position when she was voted in as the head of the Kenosha Board of Education. She and Mary Bradford, buried here, made quite a team, much to the consternation of the men on the board. Beatrice and I grew further apart. Music wasn't the only thing we couldn't agree on. I was a movie buff and enjoyed a wide variety of films. The Kenosha Censorship Board was headed by none other than my wife. I enjoyed a nip or two. Now and then, Beatrice became the head of the Temperance League. She was always off doing some community service or attending a social event or a school board meeting. Our second son, George Orson Welles, was born May 6, 1915. He had the rugged good looks of the Wells family. But again, he did not meet my mother's standards. He was intelligent enough, but he leaned towards the arts as opposed to business and athletics. His dramatic antics did not humor his grandmother, but only served to bring him a scolding for his foolish behavior. Maybe it was the stress of my high-profile job, or my frustration with my marriage, or my disappointment in our son Dickie, but I started to hit bottle more and look for other diversions. It didn't help that Trixie was always organizing concerts or battling saws, or that she had developed a close, friendly relationship and friendship with her ailing mother's physician, Dr. Maurice Bernstein. Now, it was clear that Georgie was an exceptionally brilliant child. He would not be inhibited from exploring his world. We gave him free rein. He was meant for greatness. He had the makings of a fine artist. Now, not everyone in Kenosha appreciated our hands-off approach, but he got the last laugh. I think later the whole world saw that we were right to let him explore and expand his mind. His mother and I may not have seen eye to eye on many, many issues, but we both had high hopes for a little Georgie. My inventions made me a wealthy man, and I retired when I was 46, when Georgie was just 2. That same year, Trixie's mother died, and we decided to move to Chicago. Interestingly enough, so did Dr. Maurice. The move didn't make things better in our marriage, so I moved out and we got a divorce. Then, just 7 years later, Trixie became seriously ill. What a blow. We may have been divorced, but she was still the mother of my children and a very good mother. I moved back in, and Maurice and I took care of her to the bitter end. She died a few days after George's 9th birthday. The doctor and I also worked together for the best interests of Georgie. We agreed he needed formal education, and I sent him to Todd's school in Woodstock, Illinois, the school Dickie had attended for a short time. Dickie, however, was committed to the Kankakee Mental Institute at the age of 27, and he remained there for 10 years. In 1930, I took Georgie with me on a trip to China and Japan. It had been a long time since I had felt really happy, but that trip with Georgie would be my last happy memory. Later that year, I died in my room at the Bismarck Hotel in Chicago on December 28, 1930. Alcoholism and chronic depression finally taking me. Georgie was just 15 and an orphan. But I knew he saw Maurice as a second father, so I'm quite sure he remained under the watchful eye of Dr. Bernstein, who undoubtedly took him in as his own. Thank you for listening to my story today.
Okay, well, my name is Pearl Margaret Rogers Palmer. My friends call me Margaret, and I am the widow of Stanton Palmer. I lived nearly 100 years, and the changes I have seen throughout my life were just amazing. I'll never forget the first time I saw the automobile. I was just amazed. Well, we all were. We were all just enthralled. Little did I know at the time how closely tied to the automobile and the automobile industry my life and the life of my family would become. Now, as I said, my name is Margaret Palmer, and I was born January 17th, 1877 in Essex, Iowa, to Oscar and C. Andia Rogers, and I had a brother who was 4 years my senior. And my husband, Stanton Palmer, was born on October 12th, 1872 in Newport, Rhode Island. And as a boy, Stanton's health wasn't so good. He had developed a serious lung condition, and so his doctor recommended that he go to the city of Denver in the Colorado Territory, hoping that the clean, thin, crisp air would help his lung condition. And so as a lad of only 14 summers, Stanton went on his own, and he stayed with a very lovely couple there. And it worked, because about 8 years later, Stanton was fit, and he came back to Chicago, and there he got a job with the Armour Meat Company. Hot dogs. Armour hot dogs. That company. Now Stanton was, yes, Stanton was in the bookkeeping department, and he was very bright, and he rose very quickly. And they sent him all over the place, and one of the places they sent him was Omaha, Nebraska, which is where the two of us met. And the following year, they sent him back to Chicago, Illinois, which is where we were married on April 26, 1902. And the year after that, in 1903, they sent us to Fort Worth, Texas, and that's where our son Rogers was born. Now, we called him Rod. And our daughter Margaret was born in Chicago, and our youngest child, Mary, was born in Missouri. Now, about 8 years after that, Stanton decided we should all move back to Chicago, and so we did. And he was particularly interested in the automobile industry, in the hand tools that were involved in the automobile industry. So he got a job as a selling agent for hand tools. And he did very, very well. Now, at about the same time in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, two co-workers at a manufacturing firm came up with their own invention, a single handle wrench onto which various sizes of sockets could be snapped on. They took this idea, their invention, to their employer, who wasn't in the least bit interested. So they decided they would go out on their own, and they rented some space in Milwaukee. And Joseph Johnson and William Seidemann founded the Snap-on Wrench Company. Now, they recognized the need for salesmen. They were manufacturers, and they recognized the need for salesmen and distribution. So they placed ads in several newspapers. And Stanton saw their ad in one of the Chicago papers, and he was very intrigued, and he quickly responded. And all three of them met, and they both were very intrigued and excited with each other. And so they gave Stanton the rights to the selling rights to the 5 states in the Midwest. And Stanton, in turn, dropped the 6 other lines of tools that he had been the selling agent for. Now, sometime after that, Stanton met a man named Newton Tarbell. Newton Tarbell, if you're familiar with Carthage College, Tarbell Hall, that's the gentleman that made the generous donation. Newton Tarbell had put an ad in the Chicago Tribune, and he was looking to become a part owner in a business, and Stanton was interested in that, and so the two of them met, and they really liked what the other one had to say. The two of them came up with the idea of taking the tools directly to the garages, directly to the mechanics, direct sales, and letting the mechanics touch, feel, and use the wrenches on the spot, the direct line of sales. So Newton and Stanton started the Motor Tool Specialty Corporation. And they approached Bill and Joe in Milwaukee, and they were so excited that Motor Tool Specialty soon became had the exclusive rights. Now, excuse me, sometime during that year, when we were in Missouri, Stanton had worked for the Shapley Hardware Company, and sometime during that year, Stanton just took a chance. He was very forward-thinking, and he drove by himself to Missouri, and he showed the tools, the new line of tools, to the Shapley Hardware Company, and they quickly ordered 20 sets to be sold in their hardware store. Newton and Stanton quickly ordered 200 sets of the wrenches to be delivered to our home in Chicago, Illinois. Imagine that. Well, everything was going well. And about 4 years later, Stanton met a man named Bill Myers. Now, Bill Myers was working with forged steel manufacturers, and they made pliers. And Snap-on had been interested in adding a line of pliers to their tools, and Bill Myers brought this opportunity. And so the tools that they brought came to be called Blue Point tools. And now our son Rod had been involved in Snap-on a good portion of his life. You know, when he was in high school, he worked in the warehouse and the distribution and whatnot, did all those kinds of things, and stocking and whatever. So he went to Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, and upon his return, after graduation, he became a salesman for Snap-on, just like his father. And like his father, he did very well, and he rose quickly. We couldn't have been more proud. And he was soon managing the Buffalo branch and the Toronto branch. He rose very quickly. Things were doing very well for Snap-on. And most of the year of 1929, things were doing very well. And then, Black Tuesday, October 29th, and the crash of the stock market and the beginning of the Great Depression. Stanton at the time had been elected to the board of directors, and he was the president. So he was at the helm. He was the captain of the ship steering it through the Great Depression, and he was doing everything he could to keep Snap-on and all of its satellite businesses afloat. It was also during the year of 1929 that Bill and Joe brought the headquarters to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and also in that same year, our son Rogers came to work at the Kenosha headquarters, and he worked in the Treasury Department right alongside Joe. And I, for one, was so happy to have our son close to home. You see, Stanton's health hadn't been all that great. Earlier in 1929, he had suffered a stroke, and he really hadn't recovered fully from that. And then, as I said, being the president and being in charge of, at the helm and steering things through, and he was given all this advice to sell everything and pay down the debt, and Stanton could not do that. So as a result, the executive salary was cut by 20%. Imagine that. And Snap-on did all he could, and Bill Myers unfortunately pulled Blue Point tools from Snap-on, and that made Stanton very sad. And he did all he could, and I'm certain that the burden of keeping everything afloat affected Stanton, because on April 13th, 1931, in our home in Chicago, Stanton had a massive heart attack and he died. And he was only 59. Everyone was stunned and shocked, and they even closed Snap-on on the day of his funeral. Now, I originally had Stanton buried in Chicago, which was where we were living, and later on in my life, I moved to Kenosha to be closer to my children. I moved in with my youngest daughter, Mary, and I had Stanton's body brought up here and put in Green Ridge, where we all rest together. I lived a good long life after Stanton died, and I was very blessed because Stanton had all those wonderful stocks from Snap-on. I was very blessed and able to make some very generous charitable donations. For example, if you are familiar with our Kenosha Hospital, a few blocks away, the round portion is the Palmer Wing. I donated the funds for that. I also donated funds to the Evanston Hospital, the Hadley School for the Blind in Winnetka, and I started the Mary Palmer Memorial Fund in Rhode Island in honor of Stanton's sister. Like I said, I lived a good long life, and on November 13th, 1973, 2 months shy of my 97th birthday, I died of a stroke. And we are all buried here and resting in Green Ridge. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Niklos DeMarcos. Oh, I know it says Demos on the tombstone, but we'll come to that a little bit more later in the talk. Let me take you back to my birth. I was born November 15th, 1893 in Corinth, Greece. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the 1st and 2nd Corinthians from the Bible. Well, that's the city of my birth. And it was in 1911 that I immigrated to the United States, following in the footsteps of my brothers who had emigrated here earlier and who had moved west here to Kenosha, where I was about to join them. And it was in 1916 that the Greek Orthodox Church in Racine was established, and that became our primary place of worship. Now, 3 of my brothers and I, Peter, John, and Angelo, were proprietors of the American Candy Company and the Elite Confectionery, which was located at 200 Main Street until about 1927, when the street names were changed and it became 5631 6th Avenue, which is the current site of the Daybreak Church, which it was also the TCF Bank for a while, I understand. Now, we left Greece due to political strife and political turmoil, and the United States entered the Great War in 1917. Requiring every eligible young man to register for the draft. And our brother Peter was called up serving in the Medical Corps in Louisville, Kentucky at Fort Taylor. Upon his return, he moved to Princeton, Indiana, where he was proprietor of a cafe. Strangely enough, John went back to live in Greece, and he served in the Greek army for 2 years. When he came back, he moved to Chicago to be with brothers George and Angelo, where all three were waiters in a Greek restaurant. John, however, continued his helping with the candy businesses as well and being involved with the candy businesses. And it was in 1921 that I married Hazel Cotton. Now, she had moved to Kenosha from Eagle River, and people naturally thought that she was Greek. But as she used to say, "I'm English, don't you know?" It was her favorite thing to say. We continued to tinker around with ideas for different businesses with which to become involved with. And it was in the 1920s that my brother George and I sold radios and component parts. But this business proved to be too competitive, so we closed those doors and decided to search for other businesses with which to become involved with. And it was about that time that the automotive industry started to take off in Kenosha. Inventors, some of whom you've seen here today, invented designs for tools and parts and accessories for the horseless carriage, which was taking the country by storm. But one thing that was a problem with the automotive industry was the lack of an efficient way to transport the automobiles to the areas and locations of selling. So my brothers and I decided we should form such a company, calling it the Kenosha Auto Transport. At first, we would drive the vehicles to the West Coast to the dealerships, while sometimes actually pulling another vehicle behind it. But this proved to be an inefficient way with which to transport the vehicles. So I began tinkering around with ideas for a trailer that could haul several vehicles at one time while being pulled by a semi. I designed a 5-vehicle transport trailer. As I understand, these designs are still used today, although the trailers now can carry as many as 10 vehicles at one time. I applied for and received over 5 patents and soon became a millionaire. I then became president and treasurer of our company. Now, 1937 was a low point for me due to 2 events that went on in my life. The first being when my brother and I learned that a fire had damaged our business offices. Apparently a pair of coveralls had been left hanging too close to an oil-burning heater and ignited, causing extensive damage to the wooden structure of our business. The second event was when we learned that our brother Peter lay dying of pneumonia in Indiana. And it was only 4 days after learning about the devastation of the fire that Peter died. He was 46 years old. We fortunately, myself and all my brothers, were able to be there his final days and witness his final breath. And he was transported to Kenosha by railway, where he was met by a host of legionnaires at the Kenosha train station, where they escorted his body to the funeral parlor. And he was buried with full military honors. A short time after the funeral, Angelo went back to live in Chicago. Now, let me go back to my name for a second here. My brothers and I had gone by the name Demos for quite some time, almost from the time when we emigrated to the United States. But it was in 1940, when I became a naturalized citizen, that I had my name legally changed from DeMarcos to Demos. Now, John and I continued our work with the automotive business as well. And Hazel and I moved to 6750 Sheridan Road, which is a few blocks south of where we are right now. Unfortunately, Hazel and I were unable to have children, which is something that we both really wanted. But this caused a rift between us, and we eventually wound up separating. And it was in the 1950s that I continued to make improvements in the trailer transport itself, receiving 2 more patents and acquiring a trade agreement with the city of Kenosha, forming the ND Company, which allowed us then to ship automobiles from the port of Kenosha. Automobiles at that time were making great changes, so it was necessary to continue to make improvements and changes in the trailer system itself. And I received another patent for the stabilization of the sidewalls, which held the upper tier above the lower tier. Now, this extra stabilization did not increase the weight of the trailer itself, but actually made the trailer safer to haul, while not decreasing the fuel efficiency as well for the semi pulling it. And I received a patent for the improved chassis design of the semi. Now, it was when I was 70 and my brother was 79 that we decided to sell both the ND Company and the Trailer Transport Company to a Chicago firm. I was to remain on as president in order to ensure a smooth transition, and we at that time had 750 drivers in our employ. And we decided to sell to the Chicago firm because we thought that this would increase our business. However, the Nash Company, in an effort to save money, decided to switch from freeway transport to railway transport. And these 2 changes caused problems with our businesses, and they wound up failing. But we took that as a sign that we should retire. After all, we had made our fortune, and we could now enjoy our golden years. But it was not to be. John, my brother and business partner for many years, died when he was 80. And as for me, so when I went to visit friends in Los Angeles, California, that I went to take a nap and never woke up. Hazel and I hadn't lived together for many years as husband and wife, but I was able to leave her very well off financially due to a trust fund that I had set up for her. And it was at age 100, when she died, that she was able to donate millions of dollars to charities and businesses here in Kenosha, as well as a $1.6 million donation to the Kenosha Achievement Center, which was renamed the Hazel B. Demos Center after her. Hazel is actually buried here on these beautiful grounds, somewhere to the south of us. And of course, me here with my brothers.